Hi students, welcome to lesson 6, hypothesis, meaning, types and framing hypothesis. Hypothesis is an important step in the research process after the selection of the research problem. Hypothesis is a tentative or working assumption supported by evidences. A hypothesis, in plural hypothesis, is a precise, testable statement of what the researcher or researchers predict will be the outcome of the study. This usually involves proposing a possible relationship between two variables, the independent variable, that is, what the researcher changes, and the dependent variable, that is, what the research measures. Let us now discuss the significant objectives of this lesson. After completion of this lesson, you will be able to understand the meaning, characteristics and sources of hypothesis. You will be able to describe the types of hypothesis. You will also be able to learn about framing and testing hypothesis. You will be able to explain the significance of hypothesis. The meaning of hypothesis. Hypothesis is an assumption or proposition about the relationship between the variables of the proposed research. The association between variables is tested on the basis of empirical evidence and previous knowledge. Etymological hypothesis is made up of two words, hypo, which means less than, and thesis, which means less than a thesis. It is the probable statement or a reasonable guess based upon the available evidences which the researcher seeks to prove through the study. It is also a declarative statement in which the investigator makes a prediction or a guess or an estimation about the outcome of the relationship. Hypothesis is the initial point of any investigation that translates the research questions into a prediction. It includes components like variables, population and the relation between the variables. A hypothesis is a precise, testable statement of the researcher's prediction about the outcome of the study. A hypothesis is an idea that is proposed for the sake of argument so that it can be tested to see whether it is true. In the scientific method, the hypothesis is constructed before any applicable research has been done apart from a basic background review. One asks a question, read upon what has been studied before, and then form a hypothesis. A hypothesis is usually tentative. It is an assumption or suggestion made strictly for the objective of being tested. For example, in a research study, the researcher establishes one form of human behavior or happening as the independent variable and observe the influence it has on a dependent variable. For instance, how does gender, the independent variable, affect rate of income, that is the dependent variable? How does one's religion, which is the independent variable, affect family size, which is the dependent variable? How is social class, the dependent variable, affected by the level of education, which is the independent variable? In non-scientific use, usually hypothesis and theory are often used interchangeably to mean simply an idea or speculation, with theory being the more common choice. A theory, in contrast, is a principle that has been formed as an attempt to explain things that have already been substantiated by data. Because of the rigors of experimentation and control, theory is understood to be more likely to be true than a hypothesis is. Let us now discuss the characteristics of a good hypothesis. The first characteristic of a good hypothesis is it must be testable. If a hypothesis is not testable, then it becomes difficult for a researcher to either confirm or contradict the relationship among the variables. Since a hypothesis predicts the outcome of a study, it must relate variables that are capable of being measured. The hypothesis stated as there is a positive relationship between higher education and career development can be tested because the variables in the hypothesis are operationally defined and therefore can be measured. The second characteristic is that hypothesis must state the expected relationship between the variables. For example, the hypothesis, there is a significant effect of pandemic on the learning outcomes of the primary class students, states the expected relationship between pandemic and learning outcomes which can be measured. It is important that variables should be measurable. If they are generic and cannot be measured, hypothesis framing will not yield correct results. Thirdly, hypothesis must suggest a tentative solution to the problem under study. Fourthly, hypothesis must be clear and stated in a precise manner. A clear statement of hypothesis generally involves brief and precise technical language. Further, the definition of terms is better defined than those in common language. Ambiguous terms or constructs are difficult to define operationally, that is, in terms of data collection. Use of general terms and words such as good, bad, poor, personality, social class, etc. make a hypothesis vague. Fifthly, hypothesis should be limited in scope. The hypothesis of universal implications may not yield the desired result. It is desirable to formulate hypotheses that are simple to test and yet are highly significant. Sixthly, a hypothesis must be dependable and consistent with known facts. It must be consistent with a substantial body of established facts. A good hypothesis is grounded in well-established theories and laws. Seventhly, a hypothesis must explain what it intends to explain. The variables should be defined operationally so that the predicted relations among them can be tested empirically. A good hypothesis is capable of explaining and testing significantly large number of consequences. Eighthly, hypothesis must be based on some relevant theory or discovered truth. For example, the greater the police patrol presence, the safer the neighborhoods. Ninthly, hypothesis should be amenable to testing within a realistic time frame. The researcher should be aware and understand the problems which cannot be solved for a long time because of the lack of data, non-availability of tools and techniques. Let us now try to understand the sources of hypothesis. The significant sources of hypothesis are: firstly, relevant background knowledge about the research problem. It is essential for a researcher to be well acquainted with existing theories, established facts, and previous researches relating to the research problem. The related literature thus is an important source of hypothesis formulation. The literature includes readings of biographies, autobiographies, newspapers, research reports and publications, relevant literature, informal talks with friends, socio-political speeches, etc., which can be possible sources in formulation of a potential hypothesis. It improves and refines the perspective of a researcher as to how to frame the hypothesis, keeping in view the relationship between the variables. It also facilitates to analyze which aspects of relationship have been already studied and which still remain to be tested. Relevant background knowledge enables the researcher to identify and locate the key association among the variables. This knowledge helps to find out the missing data required to describe a phenomenon. Experience, skill and inventiveness of the researcher are also important. The skills and the personal experiences of the researcher is a significant source of hypothesis. According to McGuigan, to formulate a useful and valuable hypothesis, a scientist needs first sufficient experience in that area and second the quality of the genius. In the field of social sciences, an illustration of individual perspective may be visualized in American economist and sociologist Thorstein Veblen's work. Veblen's own community background was replete with negative experiences concerning the functioning of economy. He attacked the fundamental concepts and postulates of classical economics, and in real terms, Veblen could experience differently to bear upon the economic world. Flexible understanding. A researcher must possess a good understanding of the theory and ability to deduce or assume a hypothesis from theories. The researcher should be able to spot very quickly the contributing variables in a research study. The researcher should have the ability to resourcefully visualize the output or solution to the problem. Exploratory and investigative attitude facilitates originality in the process of research. Thus, an attentive cognizance and observation leads to a meaningful hypothesis and rejecting a faulty hypothesis. With adaptable understanding, the researcher can deduce the hypothesis from a theory using logical reasoning. Analogies. Analogies are a significant source for the formulation of hypothesis and finding out explanations and solutions to the research problem. Analogy is based on similarities and differences between two situations in which a similar or the same phenomenon or event takes place. Formulating and framing hypothesis on the basis of analogy is helpful for identifying variables and relationships between them. For instance, while analyzing the research problem of emerging trends of caste system in India, we may think of how was caste system reflected socially few decades back. Arguing analogically may lead the investigator to the conclusions which may be of great insights to frame hypothesis. Scientific theories. A systematic and organized review and analysis of theories developed in different fields like psychology, sociology, political science, and even in biological sciences facilitates the researcher to provide a suggestive base to formulate a hypothesis. For example, Julian Huxley, British evolutionary biologist, has pointed out that casual observation in nature or in the framework of another science may be of a fertile source of hypothesis. The success of a system in one discipline can be used in other discipline also. The theory of ecology is based on observation of certain plants in certain geographical conditions. As such, it remains in the domain of botany. On the basis of that, the hypothesis of human ecology, urban ecology has been conceived. Dependable knowledge and understanding. Hypothesis must be formulated in consonance with reliable knowledge, since it offers a solution to the problem. Thus, a good understanding of researcher can be an instrumental source of hypothesis. If the hypothesized relationship among the variables involved is proved, then the researcher proceeds in a meaningful and scientific manner. The analysis and interpretations provide a sound base to assume the hypothesis. Let us now understand the types of hypothesis. The types of hypothesis are, firstly, null hypothesis. The null hypothesis states that there is no relationship between two variables being studied. One variable does not affect the other. It states that results are due to chance and are not significant in terms of supporting the idea being investigated. For example, there is no significant relationship between gender, that is male, female, LGBTQ and suicide rate. The null hypothesis assumes that any kind of difference between the chosen characteristics that we see in a set of data is due to chance. Another type of hypothesis is alternative hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis states that there is a relationship between two variables being studied. One variable has an effect on the other. It states that the results are not due to chance and that they are significant in terms of supporting the theory being investigated. For example, in the hypothesis statement, the greater the police patrol presence, the safer the neighborhood. The independent variable is police patrol and the dependent variable is the safer neighborhood. Another type of hypothesis is non-directional hypothesis. A two-tailed non-directional hypothesis predicts that the independent variable will have an effect on the dependent variable, but the direction of the effect is not specified. A non-directional hypothesis simply states that there will be a difference between the two groups or conditions, but does not say which will be greater or smaller, quicker or slower, etc. When the study is correlational, we simply state that variables will be correlated, but do not state whether the relationship will be positive or negative. That is, there will be a significant correlation between variable A and variable B. For example, if we want to understand that among children and adults who can recall numbers correctly, we can hypothesize that there will be a difference in how many numbers are correctly recalled by children and adults, but we do not say whether children or adults will do better. Directional hypothesis. A one-tailed directional hypothesis predicts the nature of the effect of independent variable on the dependent variable. A directional hypothesis states which way the results are going to go. The hypothesis compares the two groups or conditions and states which one will have more or less, be quicker or slower, etc. If we had a correlational study, the directional hypothesis would state whether we expect a positive or a negative correlation. We are stating how the two variables will be related to each other. For example, adults will correctly recall more words than children. The directional hypothesis can also state a negative correlation. For example, the higher the number of Facebook friends, the lower the life satisfaction score. Let us now understand how to go about with framing hypothesis. The significant steps in framing hypothesis are: firstly, to write the alternative and null hypothesis for an investigation, we need to identify the key variables in the study. The independent variable is manipulated or modified by the researcher, and the dependent variable is the outcome which is measured. Secondly, operationalizing the variables of research being investigated. For instance, if middle class is a variable, it has to be defined from point of view of field work. We may say that the individual with monthly income of rupees 15,000 to rupees 30,000 per month may belong to middle class. Interestingly, this income range will vary from place to place. Operational variables or operationalizing definitions refer to how we define and measure a specific variable as it is used in the study. Thirdly, a direction for prediction has to be decided. If there is evidence in the literature to support a specific effect on the independent variable on the dependent variable, we can go ahead with a directional one-tailed hypothesis. If there are limited or ambiguous findings in the literature regarding the effect of independent variable on the dependent variable, write a non-directional two-tailed hypothesis. Lastly, framing statement of hypothesis. A good hypothesis is concise, precise, and comprises clear and simple language. How do we test hypothesis? After the hypotheses are framed or stated, the researcher moves towards testing them. Hypotheses are subjected to empirical as well as logical testing. The nature of a hypothesis may be simple or complex. A simple hypothesis is tested directly, but a complex hypothesis cannot be tested directly. It may be tested in terms of its deduced consequences. In order to test the hypothesis in terms of deduced consequences, it is necessary to collect evidence by analyzing the data collected. This is followed by the interpretation of the results in the light of hypothesis and its deduced consequences. The necessary conditions for confirmation are: firstly, all factual evidences collected through tests or other means or tools should correspond with the deduced consequences. Secondly, the data collecting tools should take into account all factors and conditions that are suggested by the consequences. Thirdly, the consequences are logically deduced from the hypothesis. Suppose the researcher wants to test the hypothesis, effective college principals will have higher level of job satisfaction. This hypothesis cannot be tested directly by the researcher. He has to proceed indirectly by deducing the consequences that ineffective college principals will have low level of job satisfaction as compared to that of effective principals. In this way, the researcher does not test the hypothesis, but tests the deduced consequences of the hypothesis. Once all the deduced consequences after testing come out to be true, the hypothesis is confirmed. If some of the consequences are true and some others are not, the hypothesis needs to be examined afresh. The inference drawn as a result of testing the hypothesis is always tentative. The null hypothesis asserts that there is no difference between the means, but some difference may always occur by chance. Hence, when obtained difference is greater, the null hypothesis cannot be accepted. The question arises as to how much can be the difference due to the change, an estimate of which is provided by the value given in the statistical tables. If the obtained difference is greater than the table value, the null hypothesis is rejected. It is accepted if the obtained difference is found to have sufficiently small probability of occurrence. In either rejection or acceptance of null hypothesis, two types of errors are always involved. These are type 1 and type 2 errors, which are also called alpha or beta errors respectively. These two errors are so related that if efforts are made to minimize one error, then chances of other errors increase. A type 1 error is also known as false positive and occurs when a researcher incorrectly rejects the true null hypothesis. This means that the findings are significant when in fact they have occurred by chance. A type 2 error is also known as a false negative and occurs when a researcher fails to reject a null hypothesis which is really false. Here, a researcher concludes there is not a significant effect when actually there really is. Let us now understand the significance of hypothesis. Formulating and testing hypothesis is a challenging task. Moreover, it is a significant concept in research. Let us understand the significance of hypothesis. A hypothesis directs, monitors and controls the research efforts. It provides tentative explanation of facts and phenomena and can be tested and validated. Such explanations, if held valid, lead to generalizations. These generalizations help significantly in understanding a problem and thereby extend the existing knowledge in the area to which they pertain. This helps in turn in theory building and facilitate extension of knowledge in an area. The hypothesis not only indicates what to look for in an investigation, but how to select a sample, choose a design of research, how to collect data and how to interpret the results to draw valid conclusions. The hypothesis orients the researcher to be more sensitive to certain relevant aspects of problem so as to focus on specific issues and pertinent facts. It helps the researcher to delimit the study in scope so that it does not become broad and unwieldy. The hypothesis provides the researcher with rational statements consisting of elements expressed in a logical order of relationships which seek to describe or to explain conditions or events that have not yet been confirmed by facts. Some relationships between elements or variables in hypothesis are known facts and others transcend the known facts to give reasonable explanations for known conditions. The hypothesis helps the researcher relate logically known facts to intelligent guesses about unknown conditions. Hypothesis formulation and its testing add a scientific rigor to all type of researches. A well thought set of hypotheses places a clear and specific goal before the researcher and equips the researcher with understanding. It provides the basis for reporting the conclusions of the study on the basis of these conclusions. The researcher can make the research report interesting and meaningful to the reader. The importance of a hypothesis is generally recognized more in the studies which aim to make predictions about some outcome. In an experimental study, the researcher is interested in making prediction about the expected outcomes, and therefore, the role of hypothesis is considered to be of utmost importance. In historical or descriptive studies, on the other hand, the researcher is investigating the history of an event, life of a man, or is seeking facts to determine the status quo of some situation, and thus may not have a basis for making a prediction of results. In such studies, when fact finding alone is the aim of the study, a hypothesis may not be required. Most historical or descriptive studies, however, involve not only fact finding but interpretation of facts to draw generalizations. For all such major studies, a hypothesis is recommended so as to explain observed facts, conditions or behavior, and to serve as a guide in the research process. If a hypothesis is not formulated, a researcher may waste time and energy in gathering extensive empirical data. Then it is realized that one cannot state facts clearly and detect relevant relationships between variables, as there is no hypothesis to guide. Hypothesis is a tentative solution or an intelligent guess about a research problem under study. Various sources are helpful in the formulation of a hypothesis. After the hypothesis is formulated, it is subjected to testing. Some hypotheses are simple and can be tested directly. In most situations, however, they are complex and cannot be so tested. They are tested in terms of their deduced consequences. A good hypothesis is one which is testable and states the expected relationship between variables. A hypothesis has great significance in the research process.